Well, I got a very difficult task, which is make it entertaining enough that you'll be willing to stay till the very end. And that's not an easy question, particularly when I will make the introductory comment, which is some of the things that I will say may seem quite bonkers to some of you in the audience. Also, I do not have answers to the claims or to the questions that I'm bringing to your attention. What I would like to do with this presentation is to bring a certain discussion, to bring your attention to certain interpretation of the rules, of the procurement directive rules in different member states regarding framework agreements and SMEs. And open this subject, open this topic to a discussion, and hopefully I will actually learn something from you during the question and answer session. So that would be my aim for upcoming 10 minutes. So the title is SMEs and Framework Agreements, Promotion or Leveling the Playing Field. And I think that we can refer to that question not solely in context of framework agreements, but in general in the new package and the new directives. Quite often I found that we're referring to promotion of SMEs. But are we actually promoting them, or are we actually aiming towards leveling the playing field in the context that they will be able to participate equally as other players, other shareholders in the public procurement? So the question is, can framework agreements as a particular procurement tool support more SMEs getting access to public contract? Well, if we will look on what framework agreements are under the new public sector directive, there's not many changes in the definition. Well, there are no changes to the definition itself. Framework agreements are an umbrella for process ending up in award of call-offs and public contracts. We establishing general terms and conditions. Obviously, to what specifics we're going will depend if we're dealing with the frameworks that Commission refers to as framework contracts, where we got all the terms and conditions laid out, or actually we will specify more our terms and conditions later on. There is many different ways that we actually can distinguish framework agreements. The most traditional one, obviously, in regards to the single provider and multi-provider. But what I also find actually more and more in practice that we, particularly in Denmark, establish more and more obligatory framework agreements. So I guess we could also distinguish it on that basis. So is it the general framework agreements to what majority of us are used to? So the facultative one, that you have still an opportunity to go to open market and tender a contract in the traditional way without the obligation to using a framework, or actually those ones that right now mandate that you need to use them. So what are the characteristics of frameworks that could be relevant in the discussion regarding SMEs? Well, it is a form of aggregated procurement. Therefore, in the first instance, what we will all think is that large contracts will enable large cost savings, but also primary interest will be for large economic operators. However, I would like to look at framework agreements also from the perspective that we're talking about several orders that are coming under one framework. So actually, I would go as far as saying that we could see those orders as a type of lot, depending how big orders we will make and how many of those orders. We are able to divide them in the form that it could be seen like a lot. So I think that there is definitely some characteristic around framework that we could argue that. What is also interesting, and that Recital 59 was already brought to the attention by the speakers in previous presentation, in previous sessions today. So the attention is put out there today that even that central purchasing has its pros, and definitely it has benefits for contracting authorities to use it. It should not. We should be careful in the form that we're using it to not actually put ourselves in the situation that SMEs are even further hindered from the participation in the market. We're talking about frameworks and consideration of SMEs or possibilities for promotion of SMEs in frameworks at two different stages. First of all, at the stage of establishing framework agreements, so when we are under the governance of the European Union directives, and of course up there are several of tools that we can use to promote SMEs, which are of a general character and they're not quite specific to framework agreements. One of those that I particularly am interested looking at the different interpretation of the rules is quantitative qualification, Article 65. So the reduction of the number of qualified participants. And the limitation is that we need to use objective and non-discriminatory criteria, but because we're still at the level of qualification, we don't have the limitation of linking it to the subject matter. So would that be possible up there actually to consider a certain qualification of a character of SME as being possible to use? This is quite interesting because depending from different member states, first of all, quite often we will talk about selection criteria as that will be the ones to use. But I actually seen in practice for the reduction of number of qualified participants to being used different objective criteria. And please bear in mind with me that obviously the issue of using SME as a qualification and the implication of how discriminatory that is, I have that in mind and I will move to that issue in a second. Second level is regarding the awarding of a public contract under the framework agreement. So when we are awarding actually a call-off, and the governance up here will be a treaty. So we technically have more flexibility, or we should have more flexibility at that stage. Particular interest for me is multi-provider framework agreements with mini competition. So we have obligation to establish award criteria in the procurement documents at the stage of establishing framework agreements. Quite interesting interpretation of the law comes across just right now. So Article 33(5)(d), contracting authorities should award each contract to the tenderer that has submitted the best tender on the basis of the award criteria set out in the procurement documents for the framework agreement. More or less seems clear. Until you go to Danish market and you start talking to lawyers. And what I was absolutely sure is a reference to award criteria set out in Article 67 of the directive. Many practitioners that I spoke to told me, we under regulation of the treaty up here. The directive is not applicable under the call-off. So actually, we should consider, or we have an opportunity to consider any kind of criteria set for set in procurement documents, as long as they are not discriminatory. So we have the limited. We are limited to the general principles. And then the question is, if for the sake, just solely for the discussion, we would agree with such an interpretation. If then the latter would be a go. Could we then consider criteria directly supporting SMEs? For example, a maximum turnover or maximum capacity level. Well, obviously there are several elements and issues to bring to the attention. Where first of all, award criteria need to have a link to the subject matter. How will we bring characteristics of SMEs of any type of turnover of the type to the subject matter? That would be quite difficult. On the very outset, I'm quite sure that many of your faces were surprised when I mentioned that this is straightforward discriminatory. Well, in that link, I would want to bring your attention sort of from other perspective. Well, we have still using minimum requirements that are in certain way discriminatory if we establish them. Of course, right now we got Lord Young recommendation under the local rules for the contracts that are under the threshold, prohibiting having the minimal requirements as such. So that could be a great way to see for the promotion of SMEs. The aspect that could be considered in the discussion of those type of consideration being discriminatory could be, well, we're using the criteria of SMEs, but we're not limiting to regional or national SMEs, within allowing all the SMEs to compete and giving them that competitive advantage. To conclude, some comments that aroused around this discussion. Well, SMEs and other secondary consideration. Should they be all considered in the same basket, or should they be treated separately? There is a space to argue that because we are, as Caroline indicated, European-wide market, SME market, for us to actually, in practice, really open the competition, making sure that they actually are present in our public tendering is extremely important. They are, in a way, such objective is, in a way, supporting the delivery of procurement law aims in the first place. Like I mentioned, the minimum requirement, as we have in place, are accepted as a form of discrimination. But the difference is that they are linked to the subject matter. There is linkage to the contract, and of course, the proportionality measure is used. This is quite controversial application of this type of rules, and I think that it's extremely important to bring that to general discussion, because I find that certain elements that I found quite straightforward provided in the directive, in particular regional parts of EU are interpreted quite differently. One available solution that I think is, besides obvious division to lots, definitely available and definitely, I think, pro-SMEs and definitely can be included in the framework, is a limit on the amount of lots that tenderer can tender for. But then, of course, comes all the other issues with that, not to mention the whole discussion regarding to collusions that we heard in the previous session. Like I'm saying, this is quite something different, but I think that just for the sake of discussion, it's very interesting to bring it up to the floor, and I'm very curious to hear what are your opinions in a few minutes. Thank you.